Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Abels, Professor Emeritus from the United States Naval Academy. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the reign of Æthelred II, known as Æthelred the Unready, and the second round of Viking Wars, the Viking Wars which resulted in the Danish conquest of England. Now, before I go further, I don't want to exaggerate the power of the Anglo Saxon ruler. In theory, the ruler is extraordinarily powerful. In theory, his will is conveyed throughout the country and is enforced by his royal officials. And to some extent, that's true.
Right.
The kingdom was divided into shires and hundreds. Both the shires and the hundreds had royal courts. This really is the beginning of what's going to be called common law. Common law simply is royal law, law which is the right and the obligation of all free men. It's the king's law. And kings traditionally in Anglo-Saxon England legislated. In some ways, the early legislation is just simply is more of a symbolic gesture. They knew that Roman emperors issued laws, so they were going to issue laws. But I think from the time of Alfred on, the laws are more than that. Alfred intended that his royal officials actually pay attention to the laws that he issued, and so did his successors. And as I said, all free men were divided once they became adults at the age of 12. They were divided into groups of 10, tithings. Later, this is going to be called frank pledge. And it's a way of being able to preserve peace when you don't have a public police force. Every member of the tithing would be responsible for the good behavior of every other member. And if they couldn't produce the wrongdoer to a court, they had to pay the fine, which gave them incentive to produce the wrongdoer. So in theory, this is a well-organized and powerful system of justice and government. The reality. The Anglo-Saxon rulers of the West Saxon dynasty had most of their estates south of the Thames, traditional Wessex. There was no capital. The king was what's called a peripatetic king, traveled around with his court from royal estate to royal estate, and sometimes graced the great nobles with a visit, which was extraordinarily expensive to them.
Right.
But was a great honor. And one of the reasons you traveled around was because it was a lot easier to move to food than to bring food to a place. There's no refrigeration, preservatives. And so what you have is sort of like a court which acts like a swarm of locusts, descending upon royal estates, eating and going on and eating elsewhere. But the other reason was the king was showing the flag. Wherever the king went, he could have a royal assembly. And that would include his court, bishops who would be called to it, the archbishops, of course, and the aldermen. And local magnates would be able to see the king and be able to get royal justice.
Interesting.
Now, this meant that the further you got from where the royal estates were, as you went north, the less the king's presence was felt. And the king was basically only felt through the actions of his royal officials in those localities and in the coins that he issued, which had the name of the king and a highly stylized portrait and were basically imitation Roman coins. And that meant that as you got further north, the king's officials, his ealdormen and his reeves, basically were vice regents. Now, the king could send orders to them, And the instrument that was used was called the writ, a very, very simple document, which basically just was said that I, King so-and-so, greet you friendly and order you, bishop, elderman, reeve, to do the following. It's very effective. In the period that's known as the Angevin period, King Henry II and his sons, in that period, the royal writ was going to become a very effective document because it was to be returned and preserved. And so not only was it sent out, and it was expected to be followed, and the evidence was archived. So you had the returnable writ. At this point, you don't have a returnable writ, but you have the writ, and you have orders being sent out. And if the king really, really cared about something, the king made sure that it was done.
Yeah.
It tells you something about the king's power or the limits of the king's power, that ultimately the king's recourse, if an entire shire or a town had resisted his will, was to ravage it militarily.
Yeah.
And he did that. Kings did that. Edgar did that. So here's a story about the power and limitations of royal authority. It's the story of Wulfbald. Wulfbald was a thane, and he was a thane during the reign of Æthelred the Unready in the early years of Æthelred. The Old English Charter that we know him from was issued in 993. So it's the activities are the early part of Æthelred's reign before the Viking raids had become really, really serious. So let's not say this is a result of Viking raids. This probably is much more an example of normal judicial practice. So what's the story? The story is, well, first of all, we have to know that Æthelred's charters, and what a charter is simply a legal document that establishes title to a property. Charters were issued by kings, and you kept a charter because if anybody claimed this estate, you could produce the charter in the court, and it shows the king has given it to me or to one of my ancestors. And so I have a legitimate claim to them. You don't.
Right.
Charter is evidence. Now, during the reign of Æthelred, charters became really chatty. They start to describe how the king got the land. I think the reason for that was Æthelred was more active in taking land than his predecessors had, and that those descriptions of how he got the land were basically his justification for the royal possession of land, which those who now held the land were really glad to have because it basically reinforced their title. So in this particular charter, which is called How Wulfbald Ruined Himself with His Lord, it tells how King Æthelred had acquired and then gave away Wulfbald's 5-hide estate in Kent. A hide is simply a unit of taxation. It's a notional 120 acres.
Okay.
And 5 hides is important because if you had 5 hides, and if you pay taxes on the 5 hides, if you produce the soldier that the 5 hides required you to do, you had the status of a thane, of a noble. You were no longer a churl, an ordinary common freeman. You now were a noble, and your weregild, your blood price, had swelled from 200 shillings, which is a considerable sum, to the unimaginably high sum of 1,200 shillings. To kill a thane required a huge amount of compensation. So, okay. So, this 5-hide estate. So, how did Æthelred acquire it? Well, what the charter tells us is that Æthelred basically seized land from his own relatives. His relatives appealed to royal courts for the land, and 2 royal courts judged against Wulfbald and told Wulfbald that he had to return the property that he had looted from his relatives. Basically, it's a question of a stepmother, and that's always a problem. So they told him to restore the lands to his kinsmen. Now, the penalty in law, the law that was issued by the kings, for ignoring the judgment of a court 4 times, was forfeiture of all possessions and outlawry, which meant you were placed out of the protection of the law. Wulfbald ignored judgments of the court 4 times. In theory, Wulfbald should have lost all of his lands and should have been an outlaw. But what the charter tells us is he died in possession of all of the lands. He ignored all of the royal judgments, and he died in possession of the lands without having, and this is what the charter says, having made any amends whatsoever. He hadn't paid the fine, which was his weregild for it. He had just basically ignored it. When he died, his widow and son literally fought a war, a private war against the son's cousin over an estate called Brabourne. And this fight ended up in the deaths of a king's thane and 15 other men. That was enough of a provocation that it actually attracted the personal attention of Æthelred. And the result of that was a royal assembly, a judgment done at a royal assembly, which enforced the judgment of the earlier courts. And that meant that all of Wulfbald's lands were now confiscated to the king. In other words, the entire family lost out now because of this. The king got the lands, and the king was able to grant away the lands. Now, the interesting thing to me about this is that, yes, the king was able to do this. But it was only when the king's own interest, or when it became so serious that the king couldn't ignore it, it was only at that point that the king was willing to use his power and his authority to enforce that judgment. Okay, I think that the reason why it was not enforced by any locals was because this was not an interfamily matter, it was an intra-family matter. And basically, it was a domestic dispute, and probably the local lords, the local thanes, figured it's none of our business, let them play it out themselves.